What is up, beautiful people? I'm going to put two wholesalers side by side, same 200 grand profit, but I'll walk away with thousands more because I'm structured as an LLC with an S-Corp election. Watch me run the math so you can copy it and save tens of thousands of dollars every single year in taxes because you created the right entity. What does being taxed as an S-Corp really mean? Legally, forming an LLC separates my business from my personal assets, which gives me liability protection when I'm out there locking up contracts and assigning deals. Tax-wise, the S-Corp piece is simply an election I make for that LLC, so it's taxed under Subchapter S rules. The profits still pass through to my personal return, but I'm required to pay myself a reasonable W-2 salary for the work I actually do, and only that salary is subject to payroll taxes. The rest of the profit can be paid to me as shareholder distributions that generally are not subject to self-employment tax. That simple difference, salary versus distributions, is where the savings show up for active wholesalers. Wholesaling income is active, lumpy, and often high margin. If I run as a sole proprietor or as a plain LLC taxed with a sole proprietorship, almost every dollar of net profit gets hit with self-employment tax on top of income tax. When I choose an S-Corp election for my LLC, I pay payroll tax on my W-2 salary, and the remaining profit I take as distributions, typically avoiding self-employment tax. I still get pass-through taxation for income tax purposes, but I'm no longer paying payroll tax on every single dollar I earn. Now, not everything is easy. There are a few things that the IRS is going to require you to do that's a little bit more complicated for an S-Corp. The IRS expects me to pay myself reasonable compensation before I take distributions. Reasonable means a salary that lines up with the services I perform, the time I spend, my skills, my location, and what the market would pay for a similar role. There is no magic percentage. I document my rationale. I actually run payroll with W-2s and quarterly filings, and I keep clean books that separate wages from distributions. Cutting corners on salary or skipping payroll is exactly how people lose the benefit of this structure. Wholesaling fits perfectly with S-Corps. Assignment fees and double close profits are ordinary active income. As a sole proprietorship or a standard LLC, that net profit is generally exposed to self-employment tax. With an LLC taxed as an S-Corp, I carve out a real W-2 paycheck that reflects my contribution to the business, and I take additional profit as distributions. That keeps me compliant and trims payroll taxes in a way that matches how wholesaling cash actually comes in. Here are some simple numbers so you can start visualizing what I'm talking about. So self-employment tax is 15.3% on net earnings from self-employment, and the IRS calculates net earnings as 92.35% of my net profit. With an S-Corp, the 15.3% applies only to the W-2 salary I pay myself. I'll show you two exact examples and then give you a 200 grand scenario so you can see the range. First, let's assume I net 150 grand from wholesaling this year. If I stay a sole proprietorship or a regular LLC, my net earnings for self-employment tax are 150,000 times 92.35%, which is 138,525. The 15.3% rate on that amount is $21,197 in self-employment tax. Half of that is deductible against income tax, but I still wrote a check for about $21,200 in payroll type tax. Now watch what happens with an S-Corp where my reasonable salary is 80 grand. The total FICA on that salary, employer plus employee, is 15.3%, which is $12,240. The employer half is a business expense, so it helps my income taxes, but the key is this. I just moved from roughly $21,200 of payroll type tax down to $12,200 after factoring the half SE tax deduction on the sole prop side and the employer half deduction on the S-Corp side at the middle of the road tax bracket. The net savings still land around $80,000 for the year at this profit and salary level. That is meaningful cash for the exact same deal and effort. Let's switch it up. Let's do 120 grand, right? Sole proprietorship or regular LLC, 92.35% of 120 grand is 110 grand and $820, and 15.3% of that is $16,933. If I instead run an S-Corp and set a reasonable 70 grand salary, total FICA is $10,710. Even after considering the income tax deductions on each side, the savings typically sit in the mid to high four figures. This is why you'll hear experienced wholesalers say that once you're profitable and consistent, the S-Corp election starts paying for itself every single year. Now, finally, let's talk about if you're making some real money, a 200 grand scenario. At that profit level, a sole prop or regular LLC is very likely paying self-employment tax on essentially the full earnings base, AKA you just gotta times it by 92.35% again. While an S-Corp with say $90,000 reasonable salary is paying payroll tax on just that salary. Depending on the year's Social Security cap and your exact salary choice, it's common to see low five-figure payroll tax savings at 200 grand of profit, often 10 to 15 to 20 grand range. And it can be even more if you live in a high tax state like California, before subtracting whatever you spend on payroll service and S-Corp compliance. The exact number depends on your state and your bracket, but the mechanism is the same. Salary gets payroll tax, distributions generally don't. Now you do have to run real payroll. I use Gusto, I file W-2s and quarterly payroll returns on time, and I track more than 2% shareholder health insurance properly. Keep a paper trail for my salary decision, so if anyone asks why I pay myself what I pay myself, I can point to my role, my hours, my market pay data. I make the S-Corp election on time using the IRS form, and if I miss it, I use the late election relief process rather than trying to wing it. I also keep one class of economic rights in the LLC so I don't accidentally blow my S-Corp status with side deals or uneven profit rights. Now I want to say it's not going to work for every single type of business. For instance, a long-term rental, most of that income is reported on a Schedule E and is generally not subject to self-employment tax. That means there is no payroll tax problem to solve, so an S-Corp doesn't create the same savings you just saw for wholesaling. On top of that, S-Corps are awkward for appreciating assets. If an S-Corp distributes property, the tax law treats it as if the corporation sold the property at fair market value, which can trigger gain inside the entity, which is gonna make you pay more taxes. So that's the opposite of what I want when I'm holding rentals for the long term. So for buy and holds, I usually prefer disregarded LLCs or partnerships for liability and flexibility. And I save the S-Corp election for active businesses like wholesaling, flipping, or commissions-based operations where payroll tax savings are actually on the table. So obviously you guys probably wanna know, how do you set this up? So first, I form the LLC in the state where I truly do business. I sign a real operating agreement so my liability shield actually looks like a business, not a hobby. Second, I get an EIN, open a business bank account so I never commingle personal and business funds. And third, I elect S-Corp status for the tax year I want and set a reasonable salary that matches my role, time, and market pay. Fourth, I automate payroll, remit the taxes, and at month end or quarter end, I take distributions if there is extra profit. Finally, I review the numbers each quarter so my salary stays defensible and my estimated taxes are on track. Now the S-Corp still might not be for you even if you are wholesaling, if like you really don't wanna be running, like payroll and you really don't wanna be paying attention to stuff, you really just haven't made that much profit yet in business, that's okay. Just realize that you're gonna have a real big tax burden when you actually start making a profit, right? Just be aware of this, that you should be switching to this as you make more money, right? A lot of people also ask me like what salary you choose. Look, it depends on how much profit you make. If you made 100 grand profit, you can probably get away with 50, 60 grand. If you made 200 grand profit, you're gonna have to pay yourself 80 or 90, right? Probably 40 to 50% of whatever you earn. That is gonna be what the IRS wants you to at least make your salary. Unless you're making like $1 million in profit, then you could justify paying yourself like 200 grand, right? Because you don't need to pay yourself 500 grand on salary. So just really depends on how much profit you're making. So quick recap. For an active wholesaling business, the best overall setup, once profits justify it, is an LLC for liability with an S-Corp election for tax efficiency. The biggest lever is that only my reasonable W-2 salary is subject to payroll taxes, and my additional profit usually comes out as distributions that avoid self-employment tax. The savings can range from several $1,000s to low five figures per year at common profit levels, even after accounting for payroll and compliance costs. For long-term rentals or other things that are not just ordinary income, income but have other weird things about them, the S-Corp election rarely helps because rental income, for instance, typically is not subject to self-employment tax, and S-Corps can create headaches when properties appreciate. So my recommendations for the right people who really have this dialed in and really are good at setting this up is Advanced Tax Group, because they are excellent at setting up these LLCs. They set up every single one of mine. They set up my holding company, my S-Corps, everything for my real estate operations and keeping compliant, right? In the description, there's a link below to get on their calendar, let them tailor the salary and filing strategy to your numbers. If this was helpful, hit subscribe, drop your questions in the comments, and check that link for Advanced Tax Group below because they are absolutely amazing at making sure you do this right. Thank you guys so much, and I will see y'all on the next one.